I was in Harbor Freight a few weeks ago, in disguise, of course, when I actually found something useful. This little machine pretends to be a saw blade sharpener. Now, it's nowhere near sturdy enough or accurate enough to be a real sharpener. This will not save a saw blade that's been badly used and abused. But as a saw blade toucher-upper, it's really quite handy. It's a simple and straightforward machine. There is a frame on which you mount the circular saw blade and a small motor that spins a narrow grinding wheel designed to get in between the teeth. You revolve the blade by hand, advancing it one tooth at a time to get it into position for sharpening. Then you slide the motor forward so the grinding wheel contacts the sawtooth, grind the tooth until it's reasonably sharp, pull the motor back, and advance to another tooth. And then you do this over and over and over again, 20, 30, 80 times until all the teeth are sharp. The problem is, this system is too lightweight to do this accurately. A real saw sharpener holds the blade rock steady while you shave a small amount of steel or carbide from the tooth. You shave exactly the same amount from each tooth so the blade remains precisely symmetrical. There's no way to accomplish that on this machine. The very act of sharpening the tooth causes the frame to flex, and the grind will be slightly different from tooth to tooth. But if you're careful and you just sort of touch the tooth to the grinding wheel, you can touch up a blade that's growing dull and get it back into fighting form. Each time you do this, the blade will get a little less symmetrical, and eventually you're going to have to take it to a professional with a real sharpening machine. But you can touch up the blade 3 or 4 times and greatly extend the time between sharpenings. It's also handy if you're caught with a dull blade and a project that has to be finished tomorrow. You can touch up the blade, finish the project, and then take it to a sharpener when you have more time. The machine is not hard to set up. Even though the instructions are sparse, stilted, and probably translated from the original by Google. But, as I said, the machine is simple and surprisingly well designed. The saw blade holder can be moved in 2 dimensions to accommodate blades of almost any common size, as well as different sharpening angles. There is a limiter, which helps position each tooth for sharpening, and if you don't press too hard, control how much material that you grind away. This too can be moved and adjusted to accommodate different blades. The grinder itself slides on 2 rails in towards the saw blade and then out away from it. There is a stop that you can adjust to limit its travel. The grinder comes with 2 discs, 100 millimeters or about 4 inches in diameter. The emery wheel is for sharpening blades with steel teeth, and the diamond flat lap disc is for blades with carbide teeth. Since most saw blades these days have only carbide teeth, this is the disc that you'll be using the most. Once you've put the machine together and mounted a grinding disc, there are 3 more things to do that the instructions don't tell you about. First, the lever mechanism that moves the grinder back and forth has several pivots. 2 of these pivots are long Allen screws threaded into the grinder base casting. Let's overlook the insanity of using hardened threaded screws as pivots for a moment. Any designer worth his CAD program should know that the threads will eventually wallow out the pivot holes. But I'm going to use this machine gently, so I expect it will last a few years despite the design flaws. Of immediate concern is the fact that these screws are not tight in their holes. The first time I used this machine, they came loose, and the lever action became so sloppy that I could barely make it work. I suggest that you get some thread lock, apply it to the threads, and tighten these screws in their holes so that they can't come loose. Then replace the stop nuts on the screws and adjust them so that the lever action is smooth but not sloppy. You also need to check the vertical alignment of the grinder. The grinder head tilts right and left. You won't need this feature for grinding most carbide teeth, The faces of these teeth are usually 90 degrees to the blade body, not skewed right or left, although it pays to check. So make sure the grinding disc is 90 degrees to the blade. The way the grinder is set up, this is hard to measure. I found it acceptable to use a small square to adjust the side of the grinder body so that it's square to the base. Not the best way to make this adjustment, I'm sure, but better than relying on the pointer. Finally, you need to cut or file a notch in the side of the grinder guard. When the teeth are closely spaced, like on this combination blade, the guard may hit the teeth as you slide the grinder forward. That's why you need the notch. You know, half the fun of owning these Harbor Freight Central Machinery tools is rebuilding them so that they actually work. Mounting a blade for the first time is an exercise that requires an extensive vocabulary of colorful words, mostly blue. The designer has provided a system that will accommodate an immense variety of blades, but there's no way to dial in a precise position or angle. As a result, you find yourself making an adjustment only to find that it affects another adjustment that you've already made. So you start chasing your tail, and eventually you settle for close rather than precise, which is another reason why this should be used for touch-up and not for full-blown sharpening. That said, let's mount a blade. The first thing you must do is clean it. When in use, hardened pitch builds up on the teeth, making the blade look as if you had salvaged it from a forest fire. Spray the blade with oven cleaner. Be careful with this stuff. It contains sodium hydroxide, better known as lye. Wear rubber gloves and do your spraying outside or in a well-ventilated environment. Let the oven cleaner work for 10 or 15 minutes. If you want to speed it up, hit it with a heat gun. Then rinse off the blade and wipe away any loosened pitch. If there is still some pitch remaining, repeat. By the way, this pitch can affect the cutting action as much as the condition of the teeth. In fact, you can frequently improve the performance of a blade that seems dull simply by cleaning it. Now that the blade is clean, we're going to mount it on the machine and do some gentle touch-up grinding. Mount the saw blade on the blade post. Add the conical washer to center the blade, then the spring, and then the locking knob. Snug up the knob, but don't make it so tight that you can't revolve the saw blade easily on the post. Beneath the blade, there is a support post that helps keep the blade from tipping in towards the grinder when you sharpen the teeth. Bring this up until it just touches the underside of the saw blade, and then tighten it in place. Move the grinder in toward the blade. Loosen the knob that locks the blade arm in place, and move the blade forward, back, right, left, until one of the teeth is resting flat against the grinding disc. Remember that the carbide teeth have a hook angle. The teeth are set at an angle to an imaginary line drawn radiantly from the center of the blade. You must preserve this hook angle, and to do that, the entire surface of the tooth must contact the grinding disc. To check this, revolve the blade so the tooth is just 1/16 of an inch or about a millimeter away from the disc. Turn on the grinder and just touch the tooth to the disc. Inspect the tooth surface and make sure there are scratches all across the cutting face. If not, select one of your colorful words to best express your disappointment and readjust the position of the blade. This may take several days. Once you have the saw blade in place and you're reasonably satisfied that it's at the proper angle to the grinding wheel, you have to position the limiter. Revolve the blade so that a tooth touches the grinding disc. Position the limiter so the very end of a spring-actuated paddle touches the tip of another tooth. Like the grinding wheel, the paddle should be parallel to the cutting face of the tooth. Check the action. Move the grinder back and revolve the saw blade counterclockwise, then back again so the next tooth is up against the limiter. Move the grinder forward. It should just scrape a tooth. This works for most blades, where the saw teeth are spaced evenly around the circumference. But there are some blades, noticeably combination blades, where the teeth are grouped in lots of 5. You have one wide gullet in front of the rip tooth, and then 4 smaller gullets in front of the crosscut teeth. With these combination blades, place one of the ripping teeth against the grinding disc, then position the limiter so the paddle is against the next ripping tooth 5 teeth away. Finally, with the blade and the limiter positioned, adjust the stop that controls how far the grinder travels. You don't want the grinding wheel to bite into the bottom of the gullet. It should stop just before that. The instructions tell you to sharpen the saw blade by revolving the blade until the limiter snaps down into the gullet, then reversing the saw blade until the tooth is against the limiter, and then advancing and retracting the grinder. Now, in practice, I found that this does not work well, because if you put too much pressure against the limiter, then the grinding wheel will catch the tip of the tooth that you want to sharpen. So instead, I suggest this. Revolve the blade counterclockwise until the limiter snaps into the next gullet. Then revolve the blade clockwise until the next tooth is resting gently against the limiter. Cease all pressure on the limiter and move the grinder forward past the tooth to be ground. Gently revolve the blade clockwise so the grinding wheel makes contact with the tooth for a second or two. Do not press the tooth hard against the wheel. Retract the grinder and repeat for each tooth. One more time. Revolve the blade counterclockwise until the limiter snaps into place. Revolve clockwise against the limiter. Hands off, no pressure. Advance the grinder. Revolve clockwise gently and hold the tooth against the wheel. Light pressure for only a count of 2, maybe 1.5. Retract the grinder. Now, I find that while you're doing the actual grinding, it helps to move the grinder back and forth maybe just a millimeter or 2 while the wheel is in contact with the tooth. This leaves a much smoother surface. There's no doubt that the procedure that I've just outlined requires a great deal more finesse than just following the instructions. However, finesse is what makes a craftsman, and in this case, it's what produces a blade that slices through the wood rather than one that just chews through it. How cleanly does it slice? Well, I've cleaned up 3 blades. A ripping blade, this combination blade, and a thin kerf trim blade. Here are the blades before I cleaned and sharpened them, and here they are afterwards. Quite a difference. Here's a close-up of some of the teeth before and after. Really big difference. So, they look pretty good, but how do they work? Well, I ripped some cherry before and after I touched them up. Here's a view of the surfaces cut with the ripping blade before and after, and the combination blade before and after, and the trim blade before and after. That should give you the idea. So, this little machine doesn't do quite what it's advertised to do, mainly because it just isn't sturdy enough. But with a little change in procedure and expectations, it can do something quite useful.